What if I told you that the origin of Japanese martial arts begins with topless women? Well, it sort of does. Imagine this. In the mid 5th century, a carpenter is masterfully planing timber when the emperor approaches him and asks if he has ever made a mistake. The carpenter replies that he does not know what it means to be an error, and so, in response, the emperor calls forth his female servants. He orders that they strip down to their waistcloths and engage in sumo bouts. The carpenter is understandably distracted and falls into the trap. The emperor, acknowledging the mistakes that he has made, orders the carpenter executed. But eventually, the mournful protests of the carpenter's friends earn him a pardon. This story about an emperor awakening a very specific fetish in a carpenter is the very first use of the term sumo. The episode in question comes from the Nihongi, one of Japan's oldest texts. The text itself was composed nearly 3 centuries after the telling of this supposed event, which casts some doubt on its historicity. Regardless, there is no grand origin story for sumo here, despite many martial arts aficionados trying to dubiously interpret one from similar texts, such as the Kojiki. More on that later. Instead, sumo takes a backseat role as a plot device and is first known to history through the participation of unnamed, half-naked female servants. This nonchalant presentation leads one to assume that the readers of the Nihongi were well acquainted with sumo, and that probably happened normally at court. The participation of women is strange, but the eccentric nature of the emperor in question makes the demand a bit more believable. My choosing to start here, however, isn't just because this is chronologically the first use of sumo as a term. It also serves to undermine many popular assumptions about martial arts. Speaking to sumo specifically, it is often imagined as something sacred, more of a ritual than a martial art, yet this display of sumo is a spur-of-the-moment affair, and the participation of naked women would almost have certainly been spiritually transgressive were sumo purely a religious activity. This is definitely an unusual and inauspicious introduction to the Japanese martial arts. The origins of Japanese martial arts are a murky thing, though. In this video, I'm going to give you 4 different origin stories. You just heard the first one. This is the part, though, where I have to give a bit of a disclaimer. The history of Japanese martial arts is a very deep topic, and I am painting with a very broad brush. Unfortunately, it's just impossible for me to cover everything, and even making generalizations, this is definitely a multi-video project. Maybe if my channel gets to the big boy numbers of more than 50 subscribers, I can somehow string together enough nickels and dimes to do a deeper dive in the future. For now, however, keep in mind that this video targets macro-level patterns rather than niches or specific martial arts schools, as fun as those kinds of looks can be. To that end, like and share this if you find it useful, and make my graduate degree mean something. Disclaimers aside, you might be wondering why start with sumo? Surely there are more iconic martial arts systems in Japan, like swordsmanship. And while we will definitely get there, this video argues that sumo is the fundamental basis for all open-handed Japanese martial arts. And as the fundamental basis, the first question we have to ask is, where did sumo come from? We immediately run into problems when trying to answer that question. As I mentioned before, if we believe the mytho-history of the Nihongi, the 2 female servants locked in a titty tussle is the first chronological appearance of the word sumo. Both the Kojiki and the Nihongi were compiled to demonstrate the imperial line's legitimacy through historical precedent. They aren't pure histories so much as an unholy matrimony of mythology, history, and curated political precedents. Everything from before about 600 AD becomes increasingly hazy in the record. Despite the problems with the Nihongi account, I actually prefer it over the more traditional origin of sumo in the older sister text, the Kojiki. Here the gods Take Mikazuchi and Take Minakata have a test of strength, in which both take turns seizing one another's arms until the former finally breaks the latter's arm and sends him fleeing. The reward for Take Mikazuchi's victory is claim over Take Minakata's lands. This story is repeated not only in sumo circles, but in later jujitsu schools it is cited as the beginning of Japanese martial arts. At face value, it definitely seems to neatly lay the foundation for modern ideas about sumo, right down to the religious overtones. So why do I prefer the other account? To me, this origin story requires some very liberal interpretation to link it back to sumo. For one thing, a test of strength could mean anything, and what is described could as much be an arm wrestling match as it is a sumo bout. There are also fantastical elements at play here, such as participants' arms shapeshifting into ice and swords. In short, this account is marred by ambiguity in terms of what is actually happening, and the other account has boobs. Nice. Still, my top-heavy preferences aside, both of the texts have similar basic flaws. Even if we charitably assume that both of them are indeed records of sumo matches, all this proves is that the authors knew of sumo, not necessarily that sumo was actually present in the period that the texts cover. In other words, we can say that sumo was in the cultural consciousness of the noble elite in the early 8th century, but not that sumo itself had been around for a very long time before that. We have any other sources we can use then? Well, a cursory scan of the internet has references to, and I quote, ancient cave art that indicate sumo was derived from a ritual dance that would bring about a good harvest. End quote. This is possible, I guess, but I have yet to find a citation or a book or a paper that confirms this art actually exists and that it has been interpreted by scholars as being somewhere in sumo's lineage. Instead, this idea is thrown around on countless websites without any source. In those sites' defense, however, I even found this claim unsourced in more scholarly work. I want to be clear that dance and martial arts, especially in Asia, have significant and real historical connections. I also do not necessarily doubt that such cave art really exists. If anything, my concern lies with how it has been interpreted. Much like our previous sources, art is subjective and is prone to a lot of conflicting interpretations. This is how the ancient alien people get a lot of their so-called evidence, by interpreting drawings of corn cobs as rocket ships, and then dramatically narrating goofy stuff about the image. I also want to point out again that the idea that sumo developed from religion lines up conveniently with the popular narrative. People like sources that confirm their own beliefs and biases. I go through great pains not to do that here. But let's be charitable for a moment and assume this cave art does exist, and, without a shadow of a doubt, it depicts something that looks like wrestling in a harvest ritual context. The Chronicle of Wei is the oldest document we have, and it describes, from a Chinese perspective, the Japanese archipelago. Here, the land is called Wa, and it seemingly describes a much less unified, homogeneous group of people than what we're normally used to seeing on the islands. In this text, there is mention of dance, and it's in celebration of throwing seeds, in other words, harvest ritual. There is not, however, an explicit mention of what this dance looks like, or if it looks anything like wrestling at all. It is also possible that the chronicle is only describing one clan's customs, while somewhere else on the islands, wrestling might have been much more common. If we take the most optimistic position and assume that these dances were sumo's origin, then this would place wrestling proper sometime after the very late 3rd century. Finally, let's return to the Nihongi for one more alternative look at sumo's origins. If we ignore the supposed bout between the two gods in the Kojiki, this next mythological fight is usually considered the true beginning of sumo by traditional narratives. Here, the Emperor Suinen orders a fight between Nomi no Sukune and Taima no Kehaya. Sukune wins by kicking Kehaya, breaking his ribs and then stomping him to death. In the aftermath, Sukune is awarded the lands that Keihaya had presided over. This bout predates the episode of the carpenter getting distracted by his own wood, but it never explicitly calls what's happening sumo, even though it's a pretty clear example of what sumo is. It is an account that lays the foundation, in fact, for a lot of what sumo would be in its earliest form. Strong men being called forth from the countryside to compete for noble entertainment. To we modern observers, though, some things probably stand out immediately. For example, the wrestlers in this bout were kicking the hell out of each other. In fact, the death-dealing blow was a kick to Keihaya's testicles, that outcome being something that totally tracks in my experience. But at least in modern sumo, this would of course be extremely illegal. Putting Keihaya's tragic testy demolition aside, this account really sets a lot of precedents. We see sumo long before the rule set that would come to define it nearly 1,000 years later. In this early variation of the sport, it is clear that severe injury and even death were much less of a concern. I do, however, believe it was definitely a sport. I will go into this a bit more in a future video, but I want you to note here that the match in this account was arranged, seen by an audience. There was a prize for victory, and as will become clear in that later video, both wrestlers probably had sponsors. Not to mention that the word champion is initially used to describe Keihaya. While this title might have been self-awarded in this case, it hints that sumo was already an institution in these days. The only thing really separating this ancient sumo from our modern idea of combat sports is a coherent rule set and protection of the participants through said rule set. That was a lot of information, so let's do a really very quick recap just for the sake of organizing some core ideas. We have 4 very different introductions to sumo at play here. The first comes from the Nihongi and is a lewd display of 2 half-naked women having a bout, and is our first example of the word sumo in use. It often gets ignored by the popular narrative because it doesn't really play well with modern images of sumo. Namely, modern sumo is culturally venerated and has supposed deep religious roots, yet none of that is present in this first account. The second account comes from the Kojiki, and it is the favored classical origin of Japanese martial arts as found in the popular narrative. It depicts 2 gods locked in an ambiguous test of strength that decides the ownership of land. What this test of strength actually is, however, is debatable at best. The third source comes from supposed cave art that depicts wrestling in the context of harvest rituals. And if my viewers have a source for this claim, particularly images accompanied by a scholarly write-up, that would be very useful. For now, however, our most charitable interpretation only circumstantially relates the alleged art to religious activity. Our fourth source is again pulled from the Nihongi. Here we see our first clear description of sumo, despite it not actually being referred to as such. It is clear that even with the absence of rules, the brutal activity is definitely akin to a sport. There is no mention of religion or a religious dimension at all, but land is awarded for Sukune's victory. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, the first major point is that the popular idea of sumo being an activity steeped in native religion is contestable. I'm not arguing that later Shinto influences sumo, not at all, but that comes further along in history, I think. In the very earliest days of sumo, the evidence we have for it coming from or even being related to religion is mostly circumstantial. On the other hand, sumo does appear to have a relationship with land ownership. In the earliest Kojiki story and in the final Nihongi Sukune story, the victors both receive land. Whether or not this was just the traditional prize or perhaps some kind of warfare by proxy is unclear. Finally, we can tell that sumo has a lot of characteristics of modern sport, even if it will lack a defined, standardized rule set for centuries to come. What we are left with from these four sources is a hazy picture of what the original sumo must have looked like. Brutal, but ultimately not unrecognizable as a sport. What these sources fail to concretely tell us, though, is the actual origin of sumo. For a hint at that, I offer you one final bonus twist source. Here is one way that the word sumo was written in the ancient Japanese script. And here is how it was written in the Chinese script. Oh, would you look at that? It's the exact same rendering. You might have some reservations about this, though. Hasn't Japan historically been an isolated country? The answer really depends on when you're asking about. The reality is that early Japan imported tons of culture, religion, political ideology, and, obviously, language from China. The transfer wasn't one-to-one, of course, and these mainland ideas went through a lot of adaptation to suit unique Japanese needs. Regardless, early Japan just wasn't as isolated as might be popularly imagined. Historian Amino Yoshihiko, for example, argues that the waters that surrounded Japan could be as much a highway for trade and cultural exchange as they could serve as a treacherous barrier. Primary sources even spell this out. The Shinsen Shojiroku has a compiled list of 1,182 court lineages, and of those, nearly a third are considered barbarian in origin. Read as, they were foreigners. And that was just in the court. Who knows how large the immigrant population was among commoners? At this point, you may be thinking, ladies and gentlemen,
we got him.
Unfortunately, this isn't really a smoking gun either, though. While the written language used to describe these wrestling bouts was the same here, plenty of other terms would also be used to describe sumo that were not at all the same. It also might be possible that the Chinese wrestling tradition may have not been imported at all, and that the terminology I'm showing you here was simply used to describe a wrestling tradition that already existed on the Japanese Isles. Still, I wanted to point this out, though, because what pre-modern Chinese wrestling eventually evolved into does vaguely resemble sumo in some respects. Also, and somewhat more importantly, the Chinese will appear again and again in this series of videos, like the inevitable cameo in an after-credits Marvel movie scene. I'm just pointing out this pattern now because it really does keep popping up. Oh, whoa, conclusion, you say? What about the swords and the samurai? Well, don't you worry. We will be discussing Glorious Nippon Steel in Part 2, which will be linked here as soon as I release it. In the meantime, there will be a reading list in the description if you want to personally dig into some of the material that I used to make this video. As for the answer to where sumo came from, well, the answer is somewhat anticlimactically up to interpretation. Maybe it was imported from China, maybe it was a harvest ritual, or maybe it was a way to dispute land rights. It was definitely a way for nobles to keep themselves entertained, though, and it may have very well been some combination of all of the above. Sometimes we can simply only know what we know. The good news, though, is that these vague and unsatisfying answers should mostly be behind us as we dive into much better recorded history from here onward. So get subbed up and stay tuned, as next time we'll look at just how badly movies have lied to you about samurai. Spoilers, they've lied to you, like, a lot.